I'm Patricia Ezechi, and this is Proactive Empowered Careers, a space for thinking about careers differently, not as something separate from who you are, but as an expression of you and the life you want to live. Hello everyone and welcome back. In the last episode, we talked about how the way your life is set up shapes what you're actually able to do. And today I want to go a bit deeper into that and talk about space, because that's what allows clarity to emerge in the first place. So there's something I hear a lot in the conversations I have with people. Sometimes it's said outright, and sometimes it's just there in the background underneath what they're saying. I just don't know what I want. And on the surface, that sounds like a simple statement. But when you listen more closely, it usually isn't, because the person saying it is rarely sitting in a calm, spacious place thinking things through. They're tired. They're usually overextended, carrying multiple responsibilities and mentally and emotionally juggling work, life, expectations, responsibilities, and uncertainty. Their heads are full. And inside that reality, they're asking themselves to make clear, confident decisions about the future from a place that doesn't have any of that space to do that. I like to think of it as a bit like trying to read a map while you're running. You might be able to do it, but you're not going to see the full landscape clearly in front of you while you do. And this is what often gets missed. Clarity needs space before it can appear. A lot of time we assume it's the other way around, that clarity comes first, I'll figure it out, and then you'll move. But what I see over and over again is that it doesn't work that way. Clarity isn't created by forcing or by thinking harder when your system is already overloaded. You can't do it. It's something that becomes available when there's enough room for you to notice what's really happening. When there's space to think, there's space to feel, there's space to sit with something and give it the space to be seen without immediately shutting it down. And when that space isn't there, our thinking becomes clouded. And there's another layer to this that a lot of you are probably experiencing without even realizing. If your day is full of one thing after another, moving from one thing to the next, meeting to meeting, task to task, conversation to conversation, especially when things are unfinished, part of your attention doesn't move on with each of those tasks. It stays behind with whatever you just left. There's even a name for this. It's called attention residue. Don't you love it when science has got a name for everything? So even when you finally sit down to think, or think you're going to sit down to think, you're not fully there. You're carrying bits of conversations, things you haven't finished, decisions you haven't made, things you haven't quite processed yet. And from the inside, that just feels like noise. So when you're trying to think about something bigger and arguably more important, your future, it makes sense that feels hard and doesn't feel clear. Because you're not thinking from a clear space, you're thinking from a crowded one, full of unfinished threads, open loops, and things still pulling at your attention. And when you're trying to think from a space like that, it's not surprising that things don't feel clear. You sit down to think and nothing comes. Or everything comes at once. You start exploring and then you feel overwhelmed, or you go round in circles, or you spiral. And when that happens, it becomes easy to turn on yourself, to tell yourself off and think, I should know this. Why can't I figure this out? But that's not actually the right question at all, because what feels like lack of clarity is actually a lack of space. Space to tolerate a bit of uncertainty without shutting yourself down. Space to imagine something different without immediately dismissing it as impossible or improbable. And when that space isn't there, clarity becomes so much harder to find. And that makes perfect sense. Because when you're under pressure, your thinking doesn't expand, it narrows. You focus on what's urgent, what feels safest, what's right in front of you. Not because you suddenly become less capable, but because your system is trying to stabilize you. So when you try to force clarity from that place, you don't get answers, you get more frustration. And that's so easy to read as failure, but it isn't. As always, it's just information. Information about the space you have available to think right now, which is frankly not enough. So sometimes the problem isn't I don't know what I want. Sometimes it's I haven't had the space to actually hear it, to see it. And this is why space matters. Not because it's indulgent, but because it's functional. Your mind needs room to settle, to close things off, to make sense of what's already there. And sometimes stepping away is actually what allows things to come together. You've probably experienced this. You stop trying to figure something out, and then later on a walk, in the shower, washing the dishes, doing something completely unrelated, something clicks. Not because you were avoiding it, but because you finally gave your mind enough space to process what was already there. And I noticed this very clearly in my own life. I've set my whole life up around this whole philosophy and idea. Something as simple as walking. When I'm out on the beach, which I am every day, with a bit of space around me, something shifts. My thinking opens up. Things connect more easily. I can hear myself more clearly. And recently, I hadn't been able to go out for a while because I'd turned my ankle, so I was limping around, I couldn't walk. So I wasn't getting out in the same way that I did. And oh my goodness, I could feel the difference. Quite quickly. And subtly, but also very distinctly. My thinking was much tighter. It felt more contained and constrained. And my mood began to be affected. And the moment that space came back, the moment I was able to go back out into the air, something shifted. I had access to all of myself. Not necessarily answers straight away, but I could access all of myself and I could feel that difference. So maybe the point isn't always, when we're thinking about career changes, what do I want? Maybe it's, what is currently taking up space in my life? Where is my energy going? What feels noisy? What feels unresolved? What feels constantly in my mind? What feels like it never finishes? And alongside that question is this one. What gives me space back? Even a little. Because space isn't fixed and we can change how much of that we give ourselves access to. And when it does begin to change and shift, clarity tends to follow. You start noticing things. What you want, what you don't want, what feels right to you and what doesn't. And you trust it more, not because you forced it, but because you can finally hear yourself thinking. So if you're sitting there thinking right now, I should know by now, I'd invite you to just pause. Maybe it's not that you don't know. Maybe there just hasn't been enough space for you to hear it. And thinking that and understanding that changes the work that we're trying to do. Because it's not about forcing answers, it's about creating the conditions where those answers can actually come to the surface. And that isn't being indulgent, it's an absolute necessity. I see over and over again, clarity doesn't come from pushing harder. It often comes after things soften. After you've had a conversation, taken a break, stepped away for a moment, rested, replenished your mind and your body. And suddenly, something that felt unclear and difficult doesn't anymore, not because the answer changed, but because you did. You had a bit more space and you could finally see what was already there. So in the next episode, we're going to build on this because the environments you're in don't just affect your space. They shape what feels possible in the first place. So that's what we'll explore together. But for now, just notice, not the decisions you haven't made, but how much space you actually have in your life to make them. So until we next speak, take the very best care of yourselves. This has been Proactive Empowered Careers. If today's episode resonated, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss what comes next. And remember, your career isn't separate from who you are. It's an expression of you and the life you want to live.